Hi, so I'm Sam Lindsay, and I'm going to be talking to you today about an article that I read in CNN.com called Just What is the One Belt, One Road Thing Anyway? And I actually wondered that myself. Just what exactly is it? So before you watch this any further, if you have not read that article, I recommend stopping this, reading the article, and then coming back, just so you have a little bit of background of what I'm talking about. So first I want to go into a history lesson, quick history lesson. I want to talk about the ancient Silk Road, or the original Silk Road. So up in the upper right-hand corner of the slide here, I have the map of the Silk Road. And it was a trade route that stretched from China to the South Pacific, to the Middle East, and finally to Europe. And it lasted from approximately 120 BCE to the 1450s CE, so effectively 1,500 years. Silk, obviously, because of the namesake, was the dominant good that was traded. However, other goods were traded as well. Along with goods, culture and philosophy came along, and diseases were transported because people were going into other parts of the world that they had never been in before, thereby effectively trading diseases or transporting diseases. It could actually be seen as the beginning of globalization by bringing together many nations, cultures, religions, and philosophy, all through trade. So why a new Silk Road? So Chinese President Xi Jinping wants China to take a larger role in creating a Chinese-centric trading network. Its inception was announced in September 2013 by the Chinese president, and the past 3 years have focused primarily on infrastructure development, construction materials, railway and highway, automobiles, real estate, power grid, and iron and steel. This One Belt, One Road, or OBAR for short, or the New Silk Road, is actually two things brought together to make one. So the belt portion of the One Belt, One Road is the Silk Road Economic Belt, which is the road from China to Europe. And the road portion of the One Belt, One Road is the 21st century Maritime Silk Road. So this is the shipping lanes and ports in Asia and the Pacific. So here I have two different maps. I have on the left-hand side, that's the new Silk Road. And on the right, I have the old Silk Road, which is just a blown-up version of the map that you saw on my second slide. As you can see, the trade routes are very similar, except for in the new Silk Road, it stretches further into Europe than it did in the old Silk Road. So you can see that it takes up a very significant portion of the globe. But what is it? Seriously, what is it? So when I was researching when I read this article and then I was researching a little bit more about the One Belt, One Road, many critics said that it was simply a buzzword. And so I found this Dilbert cartoon about buzzwords that I thought I would share with you that I thought was pretty funny. So Dilbert's coworker goes to him and he says, "Here's your buzzword bingo card for the meeting. If the boss uses a buzzword on your card, you check it off. The objective is to fill a row." So just like bingo. And then you flash forward into the meeting and the boss says, "You're all very attentive today. My proactive leadership must be working." And Dilbert's coworker says, "Bingo, sir." Kind of funny, kind of true. I think many of us experience this daily at work with buzzwords being overused. Anyways, just to get serious again. So One Belt, One Road is a philosophy. It could be seen as a political stunt to gain goodwill. Like I said, it could be seen as a buzzword. And some critics say that the way that Chinese officials use One Belt, One Road is very similar to how American lawmakers use the word freedom. They use it so much, so often, that it all but loses its meaning. It's an actual route of trade on both land and sea. It is a way to aid other developing nations with the goal of making them customers of Chinese trade. And in fact, the Chinese state media claims that this One Belt, One Road will benefit the Middle East peace process, startups in Dubai, currency trading, global poverty reduction, the medical industry, hotels in Australia, nuclear power, Polish orchards, and ultimately the entire world. Since its inception, over $1 trillion has been invested, and over the next decade, it's expected that several trillion more will be invested. And China actually receives both economic and political benefits as well as risks with this One Belt, One Road initiative. So the benefits, pretty obvious. It's tapping into new markets that wouldn't otherwise have access to Chinese goods. China claims that the US and the European markets are drying up, and so they need to find new markets to reach. And so by creating this One Belt, One Road, they're actually quite literally creating infrastructure in developing nations, opening up those nations to receive Chinese goods, and ultimately hope that those nations start sending out exports to make them stronger economically. Of course, there's risks that come with it, economic risks, that many of the countries targeted are prone to political and economic instability as well as widespread government corruption. Security is also an issue. They've had issues in Pakistan as well as Myanmar, among others. Additionally, China does have a miserable track record of overseas investments and activities. The CNN article that I read for this actually highlighted that at one time a Chinese state-owned manufacturing plant went into an African nation to set up a manufacturing plant there to take out some raw materials from that African nation, and instead of hiring locals to work there, they brought in Chinese workers, and then they took the raw materials that they had taken from that local African nation and sent it back to China. So there was effectively no economic benefit to that African nation whatsoever, other than giving them access to take their raw materials. They didn't get any money, no jobs, nothing. So that really didn't bode well for the Chinese reputation. So to move on to politics, so political benefits are that if it's successful, then China reclaims its historical dominance in global trade. And so the risks are that because of its sheer size, as you saw on the map, both maps actually, it could fail, which means that it would devastate Chinese reputation on the world market. Also, a few of the articles have a little bit differing numbers, but there's speculation that this One Belt, One Road accounts for anywhere from 20% to 40% of the global GDP. So that's a pretty huge amount or significant amount of global GDP. And if it does fail, that would not only affect China negatively, but the entire world. And you and me sitting here in the US could be affected. So is it effective? Well, President Xi Jinping says that of OBAR that exchange will replace estrangement, mutual learning will replace clashes, and coexistence will replace a sense of superiority. He said this at the Belt and Road Forum in May 2017. And side note, because I do have a 12-year-old sense of humor, the official acronym that was used for the Belt and Road Forum was BARF. And I thought that was pretty funny. But getting serious again, this One Belt, One Road has free trade zones that sees 30,000 traders daily. And obviously Beijing's rationale is clear. These large resource-rich nations within its reach with a severe infrastructure deficit, which China has the resources and expertise to correct. By boosting connectivity, China can spur growth in the short term, gain access to valuable natural resources in the midterm, and create new booming markets for its goods in the long into the future. So yeah, obviously this is a pretty great idea. There's short, mid, and long-term benefits for China as well as the world and these developing nations that would not otherwise see any sort of economic growth if they didn't have this infrastructure brought into their countries. Of course, there's some problems. There's critics. Two of the problems that I want to point out are the transportation problems. So on the belt portion, One Belt, One Road, or in other words, the land portion, transportation cost is really high, not very effective either. A train can take only 80 shipping containers, while a ship can take up to 20,000 shipping containers. On the road portion of the One Belt, One Road, or in other words, the waterways, the ports are at overcapacity because trade isn't happening as quickly as anticipated. And oftentimes decisions are made for political reasons and not for actual rational reasons, which is what leads to the overcapacity. So these decisions to take on certain things are being made, and looking down the road is not an issue for the Chinese government. They think that if we continue to bring in these shipments or whatever, it will look good for China, which is not necessarily the case. So in conclusion, I think it's a great idea in concept and theory. However, in practice, it seems that the Chinese government is taking on more than it can effectively handle. It's a fragile project that could topple at any moment. I think business leaders, experts, strategists should be brought in to advise the Chinese government. But beyond that, something that was pointed out in one of the articles I read was that it's a little concerning that something so huge is going to be owned by, or is owned by, the Chinese government. And if this ends up taking off and being as successful as the Chinese government wants it to be, if not more successful, it's a little bit alarming, because the Chinese government is an authoritarian government, and if they wield all this power, and it's not between a couple of nations or many nations, that's a little bit scary. So that's just a little bit food for thought. Anyway, that is my presentation. I hope that you learned a little bit from me. I just want to show you my references. So the CNN article is the second article that's mentioned here. Just what is the One Belt, One Road thing anyway? And I actually recommend also reading this Time article called Ports, Pipelines, and Geopolitics. China's New Silk Road is a Challenge for Washington. It's a great article, and it will teach you a little bit more about this One Belt, One Road. Thank you for your time.